that folks can network, share their experiences, and educate each other in events like this forum. So we're really proud and pleased to continue to sponsor this one. And we are also very excited for our breakfast keynote speaker. Daniel Ives is a managing director and senior equity research analyst covering the technology sector at Wedbush Securities since 2018. Dan has been a tech analyst on Wall Street for over 2 decades, covering the software and broader technology sector. He spent the first few years of his career as a financial analyst at HBO, and then received his MBA in finance before becoming a globally known technology equity research analyst and managing director with FBR Capital Markets for 16 years. Focusing on the enterprise, software, hardware sectors, including cybersecurity, cloud computing, big data technology, and the mobile landscape. A major area of his research focus is electric vehicles and disruptive technology over the next decade. He is a highly sought-after tech expert around the world and has been a keynote speaker across the U.S., Europe, and Asia, and regularly makes television appearances on networks such as CNBC, Bloomberg, BBC, NBC, PBS, ABC, CNN, and Fox News to provide commentary related to his technology expertise. He's also appeared on the Today Show, Good Morning America, PBS NewsHour, NBC Nightly News, ABC World News Tonight, and CBS Evening News. He can be heard regularly doing radio on the tech sector for Bloomberg, ABC News, NPR, ABC, and other radio programs. Okay. He's often cited globally by publications such as The Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Investor Business Daily, Chicago Tribune, New York Post, Los Angeles Times, The Telegraph, San Francisco Chronicle, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, The Guardian, South China Morning Post, Barron's, The Times of London, Financial Times, The Sydney Morning Herald, and New York Times, among many others. Dan holds a BS in Finance from Penn State University and an MBA from the University of Maryland. Go Terrapins. We're very pleased to welcome Dan Ives as our keynote speaker.
So it's great to be here, and thanks for having me. Look forward to, I think I'll start off maybe talking about what I'm seeing in the tech landscape and maybe some backdrop, and then we can talk about what's happening more in the wireless industry, as well as what, some of the trends that I see going forward. Look, I think the elephant in the room, without talking about is just the overall market and what we're seeing in the economy. Look, my view, covering tech since late 90s, I've seen a number of recessions going back to, dot-com bubble and burst, 08, 09, and I think what we're going through today. And, clearly, we're going to go through a situation where private valuations of private companies in tech are going down anywhere from 30 to 50%. We've already seen a significant compression in the public markets, but what I do believe, and this is going to be an overarching theme, is that that's ultimately gotten a lot of the froth out over the years, and it's going to lead to the next cycle of innovation. Now, I was in Miami like a month ago, and it reminded me of the yellow Hummer era that I saw in the early 2000s, in terms of what we're seeing with crypto. So the point is, I view it all as healthy. I think we're seeing most of the technology investment in areas such as artificial intelligence. On the mobile landscape, obviously 5G has generated a significant ecosystem from apps to what we're seeing in China. And I think it's my opinion that we're just going through a cycle now that's going to lead to its next area of innovation. And if I go back, like the recession in 2000, 2001, I'd walk around Silicon Valley and they're like, we might have to take that building down because no one's in there anymore. Like, we might put a highway through it. Okay, but then you think that the private equity and the VCs ultimately funded the next growth companies from 2003 to 2007. In 2009, you know, I'd have many investor, PE. I remember like one time, like a well-known private equity that many people know, like with Jim, like at a breakfast, and the guy was crying. I'm like, okay. The point is like, that then ultimately, the next 5 years, that individual probably made like triple their money on investments in what's happening in the mobile landscape, in software, in cloud, and artificial intelligence. So my overarching view, just in terms of the market, even though we're going through what I'll call a white knuckle period in terms of tech, it's going to lead to the next innovation cycle over the next 3, 5, 7 years. And for someone like myself, where, you know, I think we built our reputation covering Apple in the early days and thinking the iPhone was actually going to be a game changer. At the time, people thought, you know, drugs or alcohol, which one you on, right? So when I go back to 2007. And then we did the same thing with Tesla, going back to, you know, when Musk ultimately had the brainchild, and I think many viewed it as Tesla was never going to ultimately do anything in terms of electric vehicles. It was pie in the sky, and look where we are today in terms of Apple and Tesla in particular. So I think it just level sets to where we are. I think it's very easy when you go through periods like this, where you turn the news on and all of a sudden you look at your 401k and you know, you're not hungry anymore for breakfast or lunch. I think it leads to the next cycle. And I think when it comes to what we're seeing in the mobile landscape, I mean, iPhone 14 launches today officially in stores. It's right now, so far, the pre-order has been up about 10% from iPhone 13. And there's about a quarter of the install base, 240 million iPhones that haven't upgraded in 3.5 years. So as much as the doomsdayers will talk about it, we're actually, from a 5G perspective, going through one of the biggest upgrade cycles that we've ever gone through, not just at Apple, but even globally. And ironically, what we're seeing in China is Apple is continuing to gain market share. They've gained about 300 bips of market share, despite all the geopolitical issues in the last few years. And, you know, and from my vantage point, you know, especially relative to the audience here, look, I think there's a number of interesting trends going on in terms of the telecommunications industry, in terms of wireless. And we spend a lot of our time, not just in the US, but in Asia, so, you know, as well as Europe. So I think we have a pretty decent global perspective. You know, I think there's a few trends. I think one, a lot of focus right now on satellite. And we've seen it with the T-Mobile deal, with Musk through SpaceX and Starlink. You got Apple and Globalstar, which they officially launched in terms of iPhone 14. So there's a lot of questions about satellite technology and what that's ultimately going to do within, you know, within the wireless industry, and especially within the carriers. I do sense that there's a strong private equity and VC-funded, driven initiatives around a lot of those satellite technologies. We're seeing that not just in terms of this first step, in terms of what we saw with Apple and T-Mobile, but I ultimately believe it's going to be the carrot and the stick, because I believe that's also going to put more pressure on the carriers in terms of the build-outs that we're seeing, especially in the U.S. And I think that's something, especially with 5G, because by the end of this year, Apple, you're going to have about 50% of Apple's install base that will have a 5G phone. Let's call it by early 2023. As consumers have a 5G phone, they want 5G coverage. And I think the one thing we hear in the U.S. from a lot of VCs, from a lot of PE, is how do you invest on the carrier build-out? How do you invest on the infrastructure? And then do you hedge your bets when it comes to satellite technology? Because it comes down to betting against Musk and SpaceX. That's probably a bad bet to some extent in terms of what he ultimately is going to build out. I think that T-Mobile deal, I just sense that that's just a first step in terms of some broader initiatives. And it's not coincidental that Apple, with iPhone 14, announced the satellite technology, even though it's just for emergency use, I think there's a view within Cupertino that that's just the first step in terms of where they're headed. And when the difference, what I'm seeing in the last 6 to 9 months versus previous years, is there's a lot of investment dollars from the Valley in Austin, a lot of Europe dollars focused on how do you play and benefit on this infrastructure build-out that's going to happen, whether it's on land or space, or obviously, maritime. And I think it's a super exciting time for the industry because it goes back to how I started. We're going through a digestion process, coming out of the pandemic, a recession's here. It's what the shape of the recession is, if it's a V or a W, we could all debate that. But I think what it ultimately is going to lead to is the next investment cycle, both from an infrastructure perspective, but also in a lot of the technologies. When I look at artificial intelligence, and I look at cloud, and I look at mobility, it's all putting more and more pressure on the networks. You look at streaming, and you look at how most tweens and teens view their content. About 73% is done through mobile. 2 years ago, that was 45%. That's just put more and more pressure on the carriers, more pressure on the actual manufacturers, Samsung, Apple, and that's why, it also goes back to, the foldable concept with Samsung, even though it's been a Twilight Zone, if you, it's just really a horror show in terms of so far the uptake. I think foldable is not going away. I think that's something that's going to continue to be a potential trend. So, I definitely want to make this as interactive as possible. And you could ask me anything, and then if there's no questions, I'll just get fake questions and just call on someone in the back, even though there's no one there. I'll just answer my own question. So, and we can hit on any topic, whether it's what's happened in the wireless industry, whether it's tech. Obviously, Tesla is a big focus of mine from the early days. Market, college football. I mean, we can talk about it. Bills, whatever you want to talk about. Bills, I'm super bullish on Bills coming out of the gate. My only worry is about Josh Allen getting hurt. Okay. So, are there any questions out there? Yep. Yeah, in terms of government spending. In terms of broadband, yeah. Look, I talk to a lot of companies that are deeply involved in it, and I think right now there's a lot of questions in terms of the pace of the build-out and who's going to actually benefit. I think the problem is that it goes back to the carrot and the stick. It's great, and obviously you have Senator Gilbrand coming later. It's great in the Beltway to grandstand and talk about the funding. It's another thing when I talk to the companies, and they're like, it's like a Where's Waldo? They don't even know how it's all going to play out and how it's going to benefit. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the federal dollars, in terms of the build-out, there's a lot of questions in terms of where that's actually going to go. And I think that's a big debate over the next 6 to 9 months. I think at the same time, private markets are, what they're doing is basically, that's why it says, you have probably about, just off the top of my head, I think you have almost $200-300 billion of private dry powder looking to invest from either on the infrastructure side in terms of the next build-out, satellite, or in terms of the software and some of the technology within it. And I view it as it's going to be the golden goose in terms of who the winners and losers are.
Hi, how you doing? Hey, there's a lot of discussion around the digital divide, rural broadband, and those kinds of things. What about the digital divide that starts at the building wall, where there's no coverage inside buildings? What's the evolution going to look like, both on the market side and the technology side, to where not having connectivity in a building is kind of like not having running water?
Yeah, well, and especially it goes back to that streaming dynamic. more and more within cities, and the carriers know this, and Apple and Samsung and T-Mobile and everyone else does, is that you pay up for your phone, you're paying up for the services, yet you feel like you're in a third world country when you're in the middle of New York City. And I think that's part of the problem. Look, that's why a lot of it's going to be infrastructure that's going to be federal or state funded. I think that's the biggest problem, is that you need to see more. You need to see more investments there. But there's a lot. Like when I look at, like, Cisco's a good example. Like if I look at Cisco in terms of where they're moving more and more toward the cloud and some of their, I'll call them like moonshot projects, they're focused on a lot of those potential areas. I think if you look at some of the incubator and some of the investments that Alphabet are making, they're focused on a lot of those areas. But I'll compare and contrast that to like when I'm in China. I mean, you could be like in a 5-walled building, and all of a sudden it feels like you're next to a tower. And I think that's the biggest problem, is that the stark contrast to the infrastructure in the U.S. compared to Europe, compared to China, and I think compared to even certain parts of Africa too, is, you know, it's. I think it's been a wake-up call, both on the federal side, on the state side, but also for the companies.
Follow-up. So you mentioned funding at the federal and other levels. Yet we just saw this big broadband infrastructure bill. You know, the wireless industry had to fight tooth and nail to address things like there needed to be symmetrical bandwidth up and down, which is not really supportable in wireless, right? Just to get some of that enabled to be spent on wireless infrastructure. Who are the proponents at the federal level that would buy into that? And what should wireless industry be doing to try to get that infrastructure funding?
Well, like we spent a lot of time in DC with lobbyists to try to get a pulse of some of those areas. And I actually think wireless industry, when it comes to that, there's a lot more wood to chop. That's sort of my sense. In terms of like seats at the table, I feel like there needs to be a significant step up, because also my sense, because in talking to a lot of congressmen and senators, and I feel like there's a lack of understanding in terms of where the congestion is. And I think it's very easy for them, because they want more things to fund jobs, that they can look good at press conferences and grandstanding and everything like that. And I think it's not there today. And I also think when you look from a lobbying perspective at big tech versus the wireless, it's a 10-to-1 ratio. And I think more and more at big tech, the lobbying efforts have gotten more and more aggressive. A lot of that's because of the lingering antitrust that's gone on. They have to continue to fight that. But also, like, it goes back to big tech wants more and more monetization, whether that's Google, Apple, Amazon, whatever it may be. And what you're starting to see, they want to own more of that rather than toward the carriers and rather than toward others that play in there. And I think that's a broader trend that's going on too. I mean, Apple's making their own chip. Intel's gone. They own more. It should, but I think that's going to be a trend that we see as a broader trend within this industry, is that the big tech players want more and more of that monetization. I think you're going to see it from the likes of Google, from Apple, and then, you know, and especially as, I think as we start to go toward full self-driving and some other technologies toward the latter part of the decade, you're going to see the auto industry and the wireless industry, there's going to be some convergence.
Dan, so on that point, how as an industry do we bring in those other components to our organization, whether it be the auto industry, Google, more on the fiber side? How do we work with them to get them as part of our association?
Yeah, because like the auto industry, see, like that's, because it goes back to like, it's easy to sit here and be like where we are today, and I've always been focused more on like where things are heading. And I think that's a good example. Like the auto industry more and more, they want to own more of the software infrastructure, everything that goes through it, and the data. You see that from Rivian to GM, obviously Tesla is kind of front and center. And I believe what's starting to happen is that the auto industry is looking at consumers when they spend more time in their cars, more data, and I believe more and more they're looking at connectivity from an auto perspective and how they can differentiate themselves. So I actually think you're going to see more of the Detroit 3 starting to partner up more with wireless, because what's going to happen is that they need to guarantee connectivity in different places. If you're paying $85,000 for a Rivian and $7,000 to have some barbecue in the back that pops out, what that's doing when you're in the desert and you basically can't communicate with anyone. So I think what I hear from the automakers is like, as they offer more services and more software, it's all about connectivity. And that's a battleground between the satellite players and the infrastructure players that's going on in the auto industry. And I think it's a great question, because I think it's a good example of like where the forest through the trees, like where it's going. What's slowly happening is the automakers want more of that piece and a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of like energy infrastructure. So, well, look, the Inflation Reduction Act, despite which side of the aisle you're on, whatever channel you watch them on, the reality is that the tax incentives there are significant from an energy perspective, in terms of battery production in the U.S., in terms of utilities. It's actually the first thing that's come out of the Beltway that's actually stimulating what I would say energy collaboration, especially when it comes to EVs and lithium refineries and working more and more with the grid within the U.S. I think it's also shown, to a question before, it's all tax incentive. I mean, that's just the reality, right? And I think more and more within the Beltway, I think there's going to, with this Inflation Reduction Act, where we could argue if it adds to inflation, actually, the act is the exact opposite of what it does. But the one thing it does do, it is causing more manufacturing within the U.S., and you're going to see more factories come, and I think you're going to see more and more collaboration from an energy perspective. Because as much as we can talk about wireless, you talk about like the big trends, whether it's 5G or where everything's heading, one-stop shops in terms of the automobile, similar to what we saw with Amazon building out within the home. I think the same thing is really happening, on the auto industry toward EVs. And I think that's just another trend where everyone's trying to take advantage of it and make sure they don't miss the boat. But the big trend too is like, it goes back to like GM, they don't view themselves anymore as just your grandfather's GM. They're looking at like, we have individuals in cars, we want to own more and more of their data, connectivity services. How do we do that? How do we distinguish ourselves versus Farley and Ford or Stellantis or Tesla or anyone else? And that's why it comes down to like the software and services similar to on phones that's now being offered in automobiles. How do you take advantage of that from, it's ultimately the connectivity. Because without the connectivity, that and $3 gets you a cup of coffee. Maybe $3.50 with inflation.
Can you talk about, with all of the smart devices everywhere, in homes, in cars, and the privacy issues associated with that?
Yeah. So in terms on the privacy side, look, it's a huge, the privacy issues on the smartphone. Again, look, Apple iOS 14 it changed the game, right? In terms of do you want to be tracked or not. That's been just a massive gut punch to the business models of Facebook, Snapchat, every social media player, targeted advertising. And I think when you look at the tech landscape, on one side you have Apple and Cook, on the other side you have Meta and Zuckerberg. And I think the privacy issues are going to become more and more front and center. And even when you look at like the Twitter whistleblower situation with Zacco this week, further highlights security issues around social media privacy. And then you also start to get into TikTok, China ownership. And I think this is something that what it's really doing is it's a disaster for targeted advertising social media players, which is why Snapchat's right now looking at AR, VR. Facebook's changed their name and they're going after the metaverse. Because the writing's on the wall. Because the privacy has changed the whole landscape, and it benefits more the likes of the manufacturers rather than the actual software players. And this is just, it's a divisive issue that's going to continue to, to play out over the coming years.
Any other questions?
Great. Yeah. Yeah, I think regionally speaking, we've seen some investments on the LTE, but I think the reality right now is that from a rural side, you're seeing more and more from an infrastructure perspective. That's where more of the investments are going to be. Because part of it is like I don't believe that putting the money there, the investment dollars, is necessarily going to pay off. I think, at least in the view of where some view it today. And I think it goes back to like what's happening in terms of the broader infrastructure, where I think it continues to sort of be carrot and stick. I'm not going to invest here if I don't have bandwidth that ultimately is going to make my investment dollars pay off. I think that's the conundrum that a lot are going over. But it also goes back to like, there's so much, like if you look at all the investment dollars that have been raised from PEs, from VCs, and all the dry powder over the last, let's call it during the free money period, okay, over the last 4 or 5 years. There's so much dollars out there, and they're like the clock's ticking. Like if you're a telco-focused fund and you've raised $17 billion, like you got to find investment dollars. And I think it does show like we are going to go through just a massive sort of growth paradigm in this industry. And I think a lot of it is going to be built on the infrastructure, but there's merging of industries in terms of what's happening on auto, what's happening on mobile, and I think that's a huge trend. Great. Well, thanks again for having me, and I'm on Twitter if anyone has follow-ups or criticism or anything else. And look forward to it, and hopefully Bill's, finally win the chip issue.